Welcome everyone. Welcome to the North Coventry Township Environmental Advisory Council webinar series. I'm John Worth. I chair the North Coventry EAC. I've got just a couple of announcements before we get started. First of all, this program is being recorded. If you see anything and you want to go back later and watch it, you can do that, but mostly it's for the benefit of those who can't tune in and watch this live. I'll also ask everyone, and I see everyone has done this, to mute your microphone and please turn your video off. That'll minimize any distractions during the presentation. And tonight is actually the fourth in our educational webinar series for the winter and spring season of 2021. Our last webinar will be Wednesday, May 19th, I believe it is. No, I'm sorry, it's the week before, it's May 12th. And that'll be a presentation on stream ecology, which I'm really looking forward to. I'm also very much looking forward to tonight's presentation, which is really very timely. It's titled Spring Planting and Pruning of Trees and Shrubs. It's presented by Phoebe Robb, who is a member of our North Coventry Township EAC. She also happens to be a Pennsylvania Master Gardener and Master Watershed Steward. Now, Phoebe's presentation is going to go probably around 40 minutes or so, after which we will have time for questions. So if you do have any specific questions for Phoebe, please feel free to enter those in the chat function of this Zoom meeting. So all screens are different, but at least on my screen, that is down at the bottom. If you either tap or click on chat, you'll be able to enter a question, and then I will present those to Phoebe at the end of her formal presentation. So with that, Phoebe, I will turn it over to you and look forward to hearing what I should be doing over the next couple of weeks as I get my yard and garden in shape.
All right, well, thank you very much, John. Thank you everybody for coming, and I'm really glad you're here. If you're like me, with the nice weather, you've been really excited about getting out into the yard and actually trying to get some things done. So tonight I wanted to talk to you a little bit about preparing your yard, specifically spring planting and pruning. So as John said, I'm a Master Gardener, Master Watershed Steward with Penn State's Chester County Extension Office. And I also am on the EAC here in East North Coventry Township. So this picture is actually of my yard. And as you can see, I do have a number of plants here that do, while they flower beautifully in the spring, they do in fact need some pruning periodically. So we're going to talk a little bit about those kinds of things. So what I want to go over tonight are these topics. And what I'm hoping is by the time I'm done, you'll feel more comfortable with knowing what you can plant in the spring and when you can plant them, which is pretty important. What kind of plants you can and should prune, and how do you go about pruning the shrubs. I'm not going to talk about trees, but how do you prune the shrubs, and when should you prune those? So those are the topics we're going to go through tonight, and hopefully I'll help you out with understanding a little bit more about those kind of things. So the first thing I wanted to tell you is we're really lucky here in Pennsylvania because we have 4 seasons, and the 2 of those are really good for planting. Spring obviously is great. The other one is fall. Both of these are really good times for planting. We can plant in summer, but you have to be pretty careful and very diligent about watering and watching your plants so they're not getting too dry or too overheated. A lot of times it can be stressful. So summer, we don't really recommend planting in summer, and winter, obviously, we don't recommend because the ground is quite often frozen and the plants just don't do well if you try and put them in. So what we want to do in spring is you want to plant after the last frost date, generally. So how do you know what date that is? The easiest thing to do is to plug into your web browser the phrase, the last freeze frost date by zip code. So I took a screenshot when I plugged into my browser, and these are the sites that I came up with. Yours will look fairly similar. You can click on any one of those and you'll get the same information because it all comes from NOAA. So what you're going to see when you do that is most likely going to be a chart that looks like this. And it's going to be labeled last frost date, or if you're looking in the fall and you want to know the first frost date, then there's another chart that says first frost date. So what you're looking at here is it's telling you what is the likelihood of having this temperature. So the last frost date is generally considered to be when there's a 50% chance of temperature hitting 32 degrees. So this year for North Coventry Township, April 23rd is considered to be the last frost date by NOAA. So that means we've got a 50% chance of a frost tonight or tomorrow. So we're right on schedule here. Now, what that really means for you is you don't want to put any of your tender plants out before that last frost date, unless you're willing to do a lot of protection. If you put out things like pansies and violets, those can handle a light frost. But your vegetables, if you wanted to start your vegetable garden, you really need to wait a little later because for most of those plants, even a light frost will kill them unless you're covering them. Now, you may have also heard about a hard freeze date, and that actually a hard freeze is defined as when the temperature drops to 28 degrees or below for several hours at a time. So as you can see, April 9th was really considered our last hard freeze date, but we still have a 10% chance of having a hard freeze by tonight. So what you want to take away from this is that you're really looking to, for most of the plants that you would want to put in the spring, you don't really want to put them out until after the 23rd. More likely starting next week is a good time. And if you want to be really sure that you're not going to damage them, then May 10th is a good target date. And this actually changes annually, so you do want to look that up by your zip code. So what kind of things can we actually plant? Well, as we're all familiar, you can put in your annuals, your flowers, things like your pansies, your vegetables. This is a spinach. Those types of plants actually can do fairly well with a really light frost. Your perennials, things like your trees, your shrubs, your fruits, your spring and summer flowering, blooming bulbs, and your flowers, they need to wait until after that last frost date and usually push it more towards the May 10th date. Some of them will be okay, but they're really not very happy. And if you have a hard freeze, then they really will not like it at all. So you want to be really careful. Now, summer and fall blooming bulbs, what that means, those are things like your dahlias, your cannas, your gladiolas, and your lilies. And again, they can go in after the last frost date. Your spring blooming bulbs, you definitely do not want to put in until fall. Now, if you got some lilies or some hyacinths for Easter and you want to put them out, what you want to do is wait until after they have completed blooming, let their foliage die back, and then you just plant them in the fall with the rest of your bulbs. So there's a lot of ways that we can plant annuals, and we talk about plants, but we can also plant them from seeds. And seeds are a little different from the plants. Typically, we think about our vegetable gardens as things we're going to plant from seeds, but we can also do flowers like these sunflowers. They are great to have in your yard. They bring in the butterflies. As you can see, this is my backyard as well. And they also bring in birds. I have the Goldfinches actually sit in here and eat the flowers, and they take baths in the big leaves when it rains. So they're great flowers to have. What you want to do when you're planting these seeds, though, is you need to wait until the soil warms up. Seeds generate on soil temperature rather than air temperature or sunlight. So most of the seeds that we would want to plant, they need the temperature of the soil to be somewhere between 60 and 80 degrees. So you really need to wait a little bit to put those in. And if you read your seed packages, they will tell you when the best time to put those seeds in. If you want to put in tomatoes, you really need to start those indoors or buy transplants to put out, because by the time our soil warms up enough for them to get started, we lose a lot of growing time for them. But there are some seeds that you can put in now. Things like your peas, they like the soil temperature fairly cool. Parsnips are another one. Some of the cole crops will do well. So you really need to read your seed packages before you put those in to see which ones are going to work for you now and which ones you need to wait a little later on. You can also put in a lot of the plants, your annual and perennial plants. A lot of your annuals, your petunias, your things like that, those you want to wait until definitely after the first frost or the last frost. You can put in things like this is a Monarda bee balm. They bring in lots of butterflies and bees and birds. So these are all wonderful things to have in your yard. And again, after that last frost date, any of these can go in. We generally think of spring as a really great time to put in our trees and shrubs, and that is true normally. Again, you want to wait until after the last frost date, but you put them in fairly quickly after that to give them enough time for their roots to acclimate and for them to start spreading their roots, so that as the dry season comes on in the summer, that they're well situated. However, this year, I strongly recommend that you do not plant trees or woody shrubs until the fall. And the reason for that is, even though it's a great time to plant them, this year is not so good because of this little guy. The 17-year cicadas will be emerging this spring. And they do a thing called cicada flagging, which means they're actually laying their eggs in the tips of the branches of trees and woody shrubs. If you have a tree that's full grown, and really mature, it can usually handle having one of those, having the bugs enter them. But if you do not, they definitely can kill them. All right, I have a video I want to share as soon as I can find it here. Okay, great. All right, this is an example of the cicada flagging. All of these little dead branches, tips on the branches, that's where the cicada have laid their eggs, in the tips of those branches, and they all die. And these will drop off the trees. So you really want to make sure that you're not having this happen to something that you just plant. All right, so there are some things you can do to protect trees. If you have already planted a tree, you have something that's a specimen tree or a shrub that you really don't want to have damage, you can put netting over it. And these cicadas emerge from the ground when the temperature of the soil hits 64 degrees. And so you want to make sure that you get this netting up before that, or when you first start to see the cicada, to try and protect it as much as possible. And this netting, you want the holes to be no more than a centimeter in size. And that will keep out any of these little critters that are trying to get in there. You would leave that netting on until through the end of July. They're done with their egg laying by that point, and you can take it off. And that's also when you could start planting trees and shrubs again, though we're coming into summer, which is really not good for the trees and shrubs, which is why I'm saying probably let's go to fall for planting. If you want any additional information about the cicadas, there is a website called cicadamania.com, which is where this information came from. And it's got a great website that will give you more information on when they're emerging and what they look like and what to expect. Okay, so back to the shrubs that we currently have. What you want to be doing now is actually go out and take a look at your shrubs and evaluate how they are doing. How did they make it through the winter? We had a lot of snow this year, so you may find that you've got plants that have broken limbs, that have spots where they've died back. This is actually a cherry laurel in my yard, and you can see the tips of each of these has died back. And that can be caused by, if we had a warm spell in the winter and it started to grow, and then we got the cold spell and a lot of snow, it can freeze those tips. So those all need to be trimmed off. So you really want to be looking at your plants to see how healthy they are. Do they have damage from disease or bugs or anything that you really want to take care of before we get full into the growing season? So you're going to be looking for things like what they call problem wood. And problem wood is if you have a split in the wood, a broken branch, things like that, something that's obviously diseased, you're going to want to take that out. Throughout the summer, you're going to be looking for dead flower clusters and seed pods that you want to get rid of. Another really common reason to do the pruning is to enhance your plant's ability to flower and also to provide stem color. This is particularly important for plants like red twig dogwood. They have that beautiful red stem on them. But if you have if you have one that you've had in and you've noticed the stem color isn't quite as vibrant as it used to be, the reason for that is the stem color is best on younger growth. So those are ones you'd want to go in and remove some of the thicker, older stems and allow it to push up new growth that's then going to have that really pretty red color on it again. You also want to do some pruning to maintain the shape of your plants. And if you have a plant that's really older, not doing well, there are some types of rejuvenating pruning that can help them. So we're going to look at how to select the pruning tools that we're going to use. Okay, so hopefully you can see this one. This is a video from Utah Extension, and they're going to talk about how to choose pruning tools, what types there are, and what they're used for. And they do some silly stuff at the beginning.
Hi, I'm JD Gunnell.
And I'm Jerry Goodspeed.
We're with Utah State University Extension. We're here to talk to you about pruning tool selection today.
There are two basic types of pruners that you're going to find. One is what we call an anvil type. And what an anvil type is, it has a blade and then it has a flat surface that blade cuts against. We normally don't like these because what they do is they crush the stem usually instead of cutting it real nice. And they're usually inexpensive, but again, you kind of get what you pay for.
The other style of pruner is called a bypass pruner. This has a blade that passes by the cutting surface and has more of a clean cut when you prune a branch.
That's bypass.
And making it much easier for that tree or shrub to seal that wound over.
We like to use different tools for different cuts, kind of depends upon the size of the cut. These hand pruners we'll use for anything smaller than about a 1/2 inch. Very small, and you know, as a general rule, what I say is if you have to force it, get a bigger tool. This isn't the right tool. So for smaller stuff, these work great.
For larger cuts, approximately 1 inch to 1.5 inches, larger branches, you can use these loppers. These again, they're still bypass, but what they have is a longer handle to give you some leverage as you pry down and cut the branch.
And if anything doesn't fit into that, Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
You get a saw, and that's what these are for. This is a smaller one. It snaps into place. It'll cut most branches up to about 2 to 3 inches in that range. But if you have anything that's really large, you can either use a knife with a motor on it, called a chainsaw, or they do make larger saws.
So keep in mind what we call the double S rule. If you're sweating or swearing, it's the wrong tool.
And visit our website for more information, extension.usu.edu.
Thanks for watching.
Okay. I really like their 2S rule that tells you that if you're sweating or swearing, that it's definitely the wrong tool. And I can tell you from experience that is true. Because if you have a tool that's too small and you're really struggling to try and cut something, you need to go to the next size up. Another thing they didn't talk about on there that I did want to mention is for those of us who have arthritis in our hands and we find that the pruners can be difficult to use, they do make ratchet style pruners, both the anvil and the bypass pruners. I have some of the bypass and they have them in the hand ones as well as the longer lopper style. So it's something to think about if you need them. Okay, now we know what kind of tools we're going to use. The next thing we want to think about is when do we prune what? The rule of thumb is if you have a spring flowering shrub, you're going to prune it after the blooms fade. So that's things like your rhododendrons, your lilacs, 9-barks, the hydrangea macrophylla. Those all bloom early in the spring, so you want to wait until after they're done to try and prune them, or you will reduce the amount of flowers you're going to have that year. Summer flowering plants, you can prune those now, late winter to early spring. Most of those are going to bloom on new growth. So if you prune them now, you actually are going to end up with more flowers than you would otherwise. And some examples of that are the beautyberry and your butterfly bushes. And any of your hedges, your green stuff, you can pretty much prune those anytime. Now there's a number of different terms used for pruning. This is a list of them. Each of these is a different type of technique, and they're used for different things. So we're gonna talk a little bit about each of these. So the first one is shearing, and this is the easiest, quickest method of pruning there is. That does not make it the best. Shearing is when you're using manual hedge clippers or electric clippers to swiftly cut through your shrubs, and it's meant for pruning them into geometric shapes, hedges or topiaries. It's not meant for pruning things like flowering shrubs. This is really what you're going to do when you want to keep something in a particular shape that you want. For example, this is a picture of someone who's trimmed. They obviously have some sort of green, and then they have azaleas that they've sheared. And as you can see, the azaleas really don't have a lot of flowers on them. And that's because the shearing is cutting away those flower buds. Now, one of the other problems with shearing is that it doesn't encourage growth from the base of the plant. It encourages growth from the tips because you're actually cutting tips off. So what will happen is you'll end up with the interior part of the plant dying back. The outside will become very thick and the interior will actually be dead. If you've ever looked inside a big hedge, a lot of times all of the growth in the center of that is dead. So when you do shearing, you also need to do periodically something called thinning that we're going to talk about in a little bit to try and keep that plant healthy in the center and to give it some air circulation that will prevent some of the viruses that can get into these plants. Now, when you shear, what you want to do is to shape this plant so that you're improving the sun exposure. And the way to do that is you really want the top of the plant to be smaller than the base of the plant. Or they can be the same size. That's better for the plant is if the top is smaller and the bottom is bigger. This allows you to get a lot of sunshine onto this plant and helps it to grow and to do its best. You don't want to have the top wider than the base. What this does is prevent the sun from getting to the bottom. And this is where you'll see a lot of plants that are pruned this way end up with the bases of them dying off. So you really want to make sure that you're not doing that. Plants that really take well to shearing are your evergreens, things like your boxwoods and your privets, junipers and holly. So those are the ones that you really want to focus on shearing for. Now, typically you're going to do, for most plants, you're going to do something called heading back. And what that is selectively cutting back the tips of the plant to a terminal, a bud, so that you're forcing that bud to grow. This is an example. You're going to cut back to, these are buds here. You cut to about a 1/4 inch above the bud that you want to force to grow, and you're going to cut it at a 45-degree angle. That angle helps keep the water from sitting on the top of it, which would promote decay and disease. And it also, because you're going close to it, it's pushing those those buds out more. You don't want to leave a long stalk like this above the bud. This actually will just die off, and it really is. It is another place for the plant to end up with disease coming in. Sometimes you'll have a crook in a plant, and you want the 2 outside stems to continue on, and you want to take off the middle. When you do that, be sure you cut down to the base. And again, if you leave the stalk in the middle, it will end up dying back anyways. Now, this is actually a picture of an azalea at my house that you can see it gets a little leggy here. And this is one I do a heading back trimming on every year. And what that does is it helps keeps it so it's not over top of my window here. It also keeps it away from the house. Anytime you have a foundation plant like this, you don't want it rubbing on the house. It damages both the house and the shrub itself. So you want to cut those back away. Now, what I do is you'll take a branch like this one, which is too long, and I'll cut it back here. This is where the buds are. So we'll do a 45-degree cut right above that bud, and the same on this side. That will force those buds to start growing more, and it won't grow up, it'll grow out. This is really, you want to do this. This helps maintain the size and the shapes of your plants. Another type of pruning that you want to do is called thinning. And this is where we're actually taking the whole branch back to its point of origin. And the reason you want to do this, if you have a plant that's gotten very full, you end up not getting a lot of airflow in the center, which can promote disease. It also makes it so you don't get enough light penetration in the center of the plant, which would cause it to die back. So you want to take out some of these interior ones, and you take them all the way back to their point of origin. This is really one that's done a lot on plants like crepe myrtles and the lilacs and the magnolias. This happens to be a lilac that I have, and while it doesn't look like a lot here, in the spring, when this leaves out, it becomes very full. So we really need to do some thinning on it. And when I look at it, it has suckers, which is, lilacs are known for that. Those are these very thin branches or shoots that come up from the ground. So I want to cut that off. And that will, again, get rid of those suckers, helps to open out the center. Another thing I found when I was looking at this is I actually have a branch that's crossing. And you can see that this branch is actually touching this larger branch. And what happens is when the wind blows, these rub against each other and they actually damage the bark on both of them, which again gives you more place for disease to come in and insects to come in. So you want to cut off any of those crossing branches. So I'll take this back to its point of origin and just cut that off. And again, that opens it out and gives us a much airier plant, and really helps to keep it healthy. Now, a lot of times your azaleas and lilacs and forsythias, they grow so quickly that they become very untidy, and you want to cut those back. So we do what's called renewal pruning on these, and this is really done. You can do this over several years to try and keep these plants in check, and you're going to cut back a major part of that plant. When you do, you will sacrifice the flowers for this year. So if you do it over, you take just a part of that out each year, you can do it over several years and you won't lose all your flowers. So this is an example where you see we have these really large branches here. Those can be cut out, and you see it makes it still a very nice looking, nicely shaped plant, but it gives it more air. Now this is one I actually have done am doing renewal pruning on. This is my 9-bark, and this was a picture of it last spring. It had tons of flowers on it, but as you can see, it's taking over my driveway, taking over this little azalea. It's just going crazy. So when I look at it this spring, what I see is I have some very large branches in here. So these I am going to cut back right to the base and take off some of the other smaller ones to so I can make it much more airy inside. And that way, when I do back my heading back cuts in here, it will be much smaller and much more shapely. Now, the last type, or not the last, the most severe type of pruning we're going to talk about is called rejuvenation pruning. And this is really done when you have a plant that's really not doing well, it's not thriving, has what they call unproductive wood, which basically means you have a lot of dead spots in it. So what you want to do with that is to actually, it looks like you're killing the plant because you're going to cut all of the top of it off back to within about 6 inches of the ground. And that will force it to put up new vibrant shoots. And then you will be able to shape those so that you have a much nicer form. And it's one where this is not something you're going to do every year, except for there are a few caveats to that. But for most part, this is something you're going to do to an older plant that really needs to be renovated, otherwise it's not doing well, it doesn't flower well, it's got a lot of dead in it. A lot of times the rejuvenation pruning is done on things like rhododendrons. You know how older rhododendrons can get, so they have very large, heavy stalks on them and not a lot of flowers. This is where you would cut those back. Typically, it can be done on a 3 to 5 year basis. Done to mostly multi-stem twiggy shrubs, things like your red twig dogwood that does really well with this, forsythias, hydrangeas, wagalias. So a lot of different plants you can do this with. And not only shrubs, but some flowers as well. This happens to be a montauk daisy, otherwise known as a Nippon daisy. This one is not mine, that one is mine. This is what mine looked like last fall. They have really pretty daisies on them, but as you can see, it gets really leggy and falls over if it's not well maintained. So this is what mine looked like that last fall. This is what it looked like this spring. You can see all of those branches just fall over, And so what you see in the center looks like dead, but it's just twigs that don't have much growth on them. So what you do is you cut this back, and this is where I cut everything back to within, on this one, about 3 to 6 inches above the ground. And it's already starting to put up these green shoots. So you can do this with not just this montauk daisy, but things like the chrysanthemums. It's a really good way to help keep some of your chrysanthemums in shape. This is something you would do annually to things like your butterfly bush, your chase tree. They respond very well because they do bloom on new wood. The last type of pruning we'll talk about is called pinching. And you do this when you're removing flowers. This actually happens to be a picture of a rhododendron flower. You want to take these off when they're done blooming. Otherwise, they put all of their energy into making seeds rather than setting flower buds for next year. Same way with lilacs. You want to take off the lilac blooms when they're done as well. But you can also do this pinching back, not just with flowers, but with the growing tips of various plants. And what it will do is it will force that plant to, instead of growing up, to grow out. This is what I was saying about with the chrysanthemums. If you pinch back chrysanthemums, it will help keep them in a more mounded shape. Any of your types of plants that you want to have mounded usually respond well to this pinching technique. A number of plants also want you to remove the flowers, not just the rhododendrons, but your rose of Sharon, your spireas, and your mockthorns. You want to take those seed heads off because they put all their energy into making seeds. So that's really what I have to tell you about pruning. But I do want to talk just a little bit about disinfecting the tools you're going to use. It's really important when you go to prune your plants that you have tools that have been disinfected. Hopefully when you put them away last winter, you cleaned them off when you put them away. If you're like me and you forgot, you'll have to clean them this spring when you get them out. And then we want to disinfect them. And you can, to do that, you can use things like Lysol all-purpose cleaner, a 70% isopropyl alcohol, undiluted. The Lysol would also be undiluted, or bleach, which you use in a 1 part bleach to 9 part water ratio. And what you're typically going to do is you're going to clean all the dirt and debris from your tools first. You can use a scrubby of some sort to take off all of that debris. And if you have some sap on, you want to make sure you get all of that off. Then if you're using either Lysol or a bleach solution, you're going to pour those into your clean bucket and submerge your tools into them. For both the bleach and the Lysol, you're going to put those tools in there, submerge it for 10 minutes. And then if you're using bleach, you need to rinse those off with clean water when you're done. If you're using Lysol, you do not. You can take them out and let them air dry. You can also use isopropyl alcohol and either spray it onto the tool, or if you have a rag, put the alcohol on the rag and wipe your tool down. And then again, let it air dry. Now, what you want to do is also not just disinfect before you start, but you want to disinfect between plants. So if you have 3 or 4 different plants that you're going to be pruning on the same day, you need to disinfect that tool between each of those plants. And what I do is I actually use a alcohol wipe. And these ones happen to be 75% alcohol. And what you do is you take that wipe and you wipe down the tool after you've made your cuts, wipe it all down, let it air dry, and then go to the next plant and trim again. And again, every time you're going to a different plant, you're going to use a new alcohol wipe and wipe it down. The one thing with the wipe to be sure of is that that wipe is wet. Sometimes these wipes, you pull them out and they're kind of dry. that won't do any disinfecting. So you need to make sure you have a wet one and allow it to air dry. That's what allows the alcohol to actually clean. So just to recap, most of our plants can be planted after the last frost date. We can plant our annuals, perennials, summer and fall flowering bulbs. Our seeds should be direct sown according to their package directions. We want to check our shrubs for winter damage, prune all that out, and prune our summer flowering ones now, and spring flowering plants after the flowers fade. And I have some resources here for you. These are different extension websites that talk about pruning. So if you have any other questions, West Virginia University, New Jersey Agricultural Station at Rutgers, Maryland, and Penn State. Now, Penn State also has some training classes online. Some of them are free, some free webinars. They also have one in particular I know it costs about $40. It's a 3-hour class that goes through a lot of good information on pruning if you're interested. And again, if you need more information about the cicadas, the cicada, www.cicadamania.com has a great website for you. All right, do we have any questions?
Phoebe, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative. Really appreciate it. And I've certainly got a couple of questions. If others do, please feel free to enter them in the chat. Well, one thing I wanted to mention, I mean, you talked about the cicadas and kind of planning your planting based on their emergence this year. I guess the one thing I would encourage is please do not spray for cicadas. They really are not a pest bug. It's a natural, very natural cycle that they're undergoing, and we're not used to it because it happens so rarely. But obviously spraying would damage not only the cicadas, but also every other bug out there that is working to, basically help our plants by pollinating.
And that's a really good point, John. And there's really, the research that I have seen doesn't indicate that any of the sprays are all that effective on them. You really want to, if you have a plant you want to protect, you really need to cover it. The netting works, burlap works, things like that. So it's, that's really the best way to handle it.
Yep, good to know.
And by the way, if you do go to the cicadamania.com, just a little known fact, cicadas are actually edible. Didn't know that?
I don't know that I'm that hungry, but thank you. Good to know. Another question. Is there a difference in how we should take care of native species of plants versus plants that are introduced?
Yes and no. Typically, your native plants don't require as much pruning as your introduced plants. And though you can prune them, for example, if the 9-bark, which is a native plant, I do prune that back because as you saw in the picture, if you don't, they can really take over. So it depends on what you want. If you have a very natural area and you want them to be natural, you don't need to do a lot of pruning other than periodic thinning out so that they don't, you want to keep them so there's enough interior airspace and sunlight that the interior of the plant does not die. And if you have one that's growing really, really well, then you can end up getting them so thick in the center that you'll have dead leaves or dead branches in there. And those should be pruned out.
All right, good. When it comes to the cicadas, should we worry more about small trees planted last year than our mature trees?
I would worry more about the small trees. The mature trees should be able to weather them. While the cicadas do damage, they do it just to the tips. So a mature tree, probably I mean, it'll be affected, but it won't really damage it that much. Whereas if you just planted a tree last year, it's still expanding its root base. And that stress might really be a lot for it. So I would recommend, if you have a tree you just planted, that you want to go ahead and put some netting over it.
So that would be like trees planted last fall, for example.
Last fall, correct.
Okay, that's good to know. Let's see, I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. One question I have for you, you were talking about at the very beginning, the timing for planting and the likely, last frost, last freeze. I know I grew up in the Midwest, and we always, my parents would read the Farmer's Almanac as though it were the Bible. What's coming for this season, what's coming for
yes.
that. I don't know if it's something that you've read. I'd be curious to know if you think that if there's any wisdom in some of the recommendations you get in publications like the Farmer's Almanac.
Most of the things that come out of things like the Farmer's Almanac are really based on historical. So what did we do in the past? And, if it worked well, then we're going to recommend that in the future. They're not, my concern with a lot of those is because they're looking back, and we're in the process of climate change, they're not looking forward, which is, we know that weather is getting weirder. Sometimes, I mean, we have these freakish snows late in the year that we maybe didn't have 50 years ago. So it's one of those. I would be more likely to look at what are we seeing coming out of things like the universities, where they're actually doing research on what's going on now. What can we expect based on the changes we're seeing?
How does climate change affect what you're talking about? And are things changing, and are you seeing, a different timing or different, for example, plants that are thriving given our climate is changing?
There are definitely changes going on. And we are seeing that our last frost is earlier than it used to be. It used to be, they would tell you that the last frost was May 15th to May 30th. So now we're talking April 23rd to May 10th. So it's definitely moving. Same as the first frost in the fall. It used to be that they would tell you the first frost was September 30th. And now it's October 15th to October 30th. Wow. Where in actuality, it might actually be December 15th. So things are definitely changing. We are seeing that there are a number of plants that are now able to thrive in our area that didn't used to. For example, some of the crepe myrtles. It used to be crepe myrtles were only found down south. And now we're in zone 5, and we're actually at the top of their range right now. So there's a lot of things that we are seeing changes. Same goes with some of the plants that we're used to that like it really cold. Hemlocks come to mind. While part of the reason we're seeing more trouble with the woolly adelgid is that the hemlocks are under more stress because it's warmer. So that's what we're seeing a lot of, is that there's a lot of damaged insects that are coming that didn't used to survive here because it was colder, diseases that didn't used to survive here again because it was colder. So there's a lot of changes that are happening that are affecting what plants survive here and what plants are just marginal.
So I think with that, we can wrap up tonight. Phoebe, thank you very much. This was a really interesting presentation, not only interesting, but also full of really useful, practical suggestions. And again, thanks everyone for connecting with us, and look forward to seeing you hopefully for our May webinar. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you all.
All right. Good night.